So hello and welcome. My name is Victoria Keane, as I've said. I'm from Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our summer learning programme. This offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics that you've told us you're interested in. And today's event is on nutrient neutrality. So this summer learning programme is brought to you by Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre. This slide summarises who we are and what we do. We launched the centre following extensive research and consultation with you across local governments and with a whole range of other partners to determine where authorities most need support and how this can be best delivered. We look forward to hearing from you later. We've got a survey that we'll put in the chat, and we'd like you to tell us how we've done, but also what we should do at future sessions. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we go. Here's the agenda. So we'll hear in a minute from Gemma Nelms and Alan Swan from Stantec. Then we'll have a Q&A, and we'll be joined by Lisa Palfreman from Homes England. So please ensure you get all of your questions in the chat. We'll try to cover them as best we can. And without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Gemma Nelms, Senior Engineer from Stantec, who's going to start us off. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria, and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. So just to give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about in this session, we're going to discuss nutrient neutrality as a whole. So the background, the environmental issue, a little bit about the legal background. Then we're going to go on to how it's actually affecting land development across the country. And then finally, we're going to run through a case study of an example of what you can do about it. So hopefully by the end of the session today, you will know a little bit more about the issue as a whole and mitigation strategies, specifically with a focus on nature-based solutions, which is what our case study is going to be on. Next slide, please. So just as Victoria's already introduced me, but I'll just give another introduction. So my name's Gemma Nelms. I'm a senior engineer in the water management team here at Stantec. I predominantly focus on nutrient neutrality, although I do have a background in flood risk and drainage. I'll just hand over to Alan to introduce himself as well.
Hi, well, just very briefly, I'll be handing back over to Gemma to just do most of this talk. Actually, I'll be joining you for the Q&A, but I'm a development director within Stantec, really looking after how we then manage this from a development side and actually on the delivery side of these things going forward. And I'll hand you back over to Gemma.
Thanks, Alan. Can we have the next slide, please? So to start with, I just want to run through the environmental issue. So what actually is the problem? What is nutrient neutrality? What is the reason why we need to have nutrient neutral development? So it's a huge environmental issue that's affecting lots of our designated sites across the country. And the issue is increased levels of nutrients, so nitrogen and phosphorus in particular. And this increased load of nutrients, it promotes algal growth. And you can see on the picture on the slide, hopefully, you know, a really good example of this, these algal blankets that kind of cover the water course, the water bodies. And what happens is that the sunlight and oxygen can't get down, and the habitats as a result end up being put into unfavourable conditions. So new developments will continue to put pressure on this, the more developments we've got coming forwards. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail as we kind of go through this presentation, but that's kind of that's what's happening at the kind of end receptor site, if you like. Next slide, please. So where are these nutrients coming from? So I've just mentioned obviously new development and residential development and wastewater. So our residential developments, the foul water from those goes generally to a wastewater treatment works, which then gets treated and discharges into our kind of hydrological catchments. So one of the sources of these is the actual treatment works themselves. So the level of which the treatment works actually will remove the nutrients, it differs across the country, and some treatment works have much better mechanisms in place to treat those nutrients, and some have none at all. So that's where we're getting this fluctuation in nutrients coming from those treatment works. So another source of nutrients is agriculture. So you've got leaching from the fertilizer, manure and slurry stores, and soil erosion through watercourses through that agricultural land. So that's kind of forming that that mechanism for the nutrients to actually come from the agricultural land and join our watercourses, and then ending up in those designated sites that we've talked about. There's also sources of nutrients from brownfield lands, so landfill leachate and contaminated land, and then obviously kind of storm overflows and things. So not just from the treatment works where it's not being treated enough, but also from the overflows of those. So in heavy rainfall events where you get kind of pumping stations and treatment works are, they don't have the capacity there. So next slide, please. So just to touch on the legal background very briefly. So in 2018, the ECJ ruled on what's called the Dutch nitrogen case. And that basically said that there should be no reasonable scientific doubt as to the absence of adverse effects on each plan or project on the integrity of the site concerned. And when they're talking about the site concerned, that is these designated sites which have been identified as having unfavourable conditions. So Natural England has a responsibility to protect these designated sites. So as a result, they issued they issued letters to LPAs which basically said that planning approval for new development, which would increase overnight stays and have an adverse impact on these unfavourable habitats or unfavourable condition habitats, could not come forward unless they could demonstrate something called nutrient neutrality. And so nutrient neutrality enables decision makers to assess and quantify mitigation requirements for new developments. So when we're saying that new developments need to be nutrient neutral, it's essentially a no detriment approach. Each development has to have a no detriment approach, so they aren't increasing that nutrient load on those designated sites. And the mitigation solutions need to be within the same catchment, so within the same area that the site is actually potentially going to be affecting. And obviously, therefore, that's reducing the amount of nutrients that's actually getting to that designated site. So where is this happening? I think this question's been asked in the chat. So you can see on the slide there a map which shows the Natural England defined catchments, which is where habitat sites are found to be in unfavourable condition. So when we're saying unfavourable condition, we're talking about this eutrophication, this algal growth, excessive algal growth that is a result of nutrients. So details of these catchments were issued to the affected local authorities. I know that a lot of the audience today are local authorities, so if your area is affected, then I'm sure that you will be aware of it. Can I have the next slide, please? So this actually has affected 74 local planning authorities across the country. So the plan on the screen here has got the blue areas show the actual local planning authorities that have been affected. So you can see that the orange areas are the nutrient impact areas, and actually it's a much wider area than just those small catchments. So as an example, for the Stodmarsh region in Kent, in the southeast, the actual nutrient region is quite small, but actually the area that's affected is quite large. So it's just a key point to note, really. So we've gone over some of the main kind of background of what nutrient neutrality is and why it's happening and where it's happening. And what I want to do now is just run through with you a very quick overview of how we can actually calculate nutrient budgets. So how we can calculate the nutrient impact that a development might be causing on those designated sites. And that budget then gives us the ability to quantify what needs to be mitigated. So on the screen here, you can see a version of a design tree. So this is something that's been developed by Natural England and has been taken on by the authorities to basically give you a flow chart that should give you a step-by-step process as to whether or not you need to apply, in the first instance, whether or not you need to apply nutrient neutrality, or whether or not once you kind of work your way through it, whether or not your development actually requires mitigation. So I'm not going to run through it in a massive amount of detail, but I'll just start at the top. And the kind of key point here really is that, does the development generate wastewater from overnight use? So that's where we're having new residential developments and things like that actually are generating overnight use. So if the answer is no, there is no overnight use generated, then the methodology is not applicable and you draw a line. If it does generate overnight use, then the next question is it in the catchment? And it might not be, the site itself might not lie within the catchment, but is the wastewater being discharged within the catchment? And that is a key differentiation there. So if the wastewater is being discharged into the catchment, that is when you begin the 4-stage process, which has been set out for us by Natural England, in which we calculate the nutrient budget. And by doing that, we're looking at the additional foul loading from overnight stays. We're looking at the nutrient load from the existing land use. So the existing land use for the last 10 years has a key impact onto what your likely mitigation is going to require. The nutrient load from the proposed master plan. So that's looking at the surface water runoff associated with this new urban area and urban development. And then your stage 4 then is where you add it all together and your net change gives you your budget. So if your nutrient budget comes out as positive, then you need mitigation, and it will give you a value in kilograms of how much you have to mitigate. And then if it's negative, then you're one of the lucky ones and you don't require mitigation. So that's the process. I've got a worked example to run through with everybody, so which hopefully will give a little bit more context. Next slide, please. So we've got stage 1. So that's your nutrient load from wastewater. Now, one thing that I just want to highlight to everybody, and hopefully this worked example is gonna illustrate, is the importance of a permit level on a wastewater treatment works. So when we're looking at a nutrient budget, we're looking at it gets measured at the downstream end of the treatment works that site goes to. So if your site goes to a treatment works which has, as you can see on the screen here, a wastewater discharge permit for P as 1, so site 1 has a permit of 1 milligram per litre, then your nutrient load from your additional foul is going to be 47.34 kilograms in this instance. The exact same site, so the same new amount of dwellings and the same occupancy rate, the same water use, but doesn't have a discharge permit, you have to use the standard rate, which is given to us by Natural England, of 8 milligrams per litre, which is significantly bigger than 1, which then ends up with a nutrient load from additional foul of 420 kilograms of total phosphorus. So you can just see there quite clearly the difference, and this is going to be illustrated throughout the worked example. So we've got site 1, which has a permit of 1 milligram, and site 2, which does not have a permit. They're the same site, but they're just going to one that's permitted or not. Next slide, please. So then we move on to stage 2, which is looking at the existing land use, the nutrient load from the existing land use. So as I said before, this has a big impact depending on what the current land use is. And I mentioned this has to be proven over 10 years. So that's Natural England's guidance, is that for the last 10 years, you have to know that's how long you have to know that land has been used for that. So as an example, things like chicken farms and pig farms are very high nutrient loaders, but you have to have had that in production for 10 years, and it has to be a significant proportion of the area of land has to have been used intensively for that purpose. Similarly for something like dairy, which again is quite a high phosphate loader. So looking at this, then we're looking at the soil drainage type, so whether it's impeded or whether it's free draining. That also has a very big impact. You're looking at the average rainfall and then your presence within a nitrate vulnerable zone. And that will give us our nutrient load from the existing land. So in this case, the existing land is cereals, so cereal cropping. We've got 10 hectares of land, so that's giving us a pre-construction nutrient load of 9.82. Next slide, please. So we know our nutrient load from the additional foul the proposed development. We've got our nutrient load from the existing land use. Now we're going to look at the nutrient load from the proposed land. So again, there is a nutrient load rate which comes from Natural England, which is given to us for residential urban land. So that's the amount of phosphates that will be generated by just the surface water runoff of an urban residential development. We then take into account the green space within that master plan, and that then again gives us our nutrient load. So we've got 1.57 kilograms there. Next slide, please. So then we look at our budget. So we add all of those numbers together and it gives us a budget with a buffer, which again is in the Natural England guidance. This is a 20% buffer, which is added to give scientific certainty. You only add this buffer if you actually have a positive number, obviously. So if you require mitigation, your numbers come out as positive, you add this 20% buffer. So as you can see, we've got site 1, again, which had the permit of 1 milligram per litre, has a nutrient budget of 59.96 kilograms per year. Site 2, without the permit, has a nutrient budget of 495 kilograms per year. So you can see that the huge difference between discharging to a treatment works, which has a permit, and discharging to one which doesn't. Now, I have noticed in the chat that there's a question around how you find that out in terms of actually where do you get that information in terms of the permit levels. So all of the water companies should issue that information, so that is available to us. One thing to note is that obviously the upgrades in wastewater treatment works happen in cycles, known as asset management period cycles. So they get agreed through Ofwat, and obviously because they're a regulated system. So if there may well be planned upgrades, and a lot of wastewater treatment works, or a lot of water companies, sorry, are bringing forward their treatment into the next AMP cycle to actually improve those permit levels and actually to start actually having those permits in place. But all of that information is freely available from whichever water company you fall within. Next slide, please. So this then gives us our mitigation requirement estimate. So we can estimate how much, based on our budget, which we've just seen on the previous slide, we can estimate how much mitigation, what that looks like in terms of the mitigation. You know, when we talk about kilograms, that's quite hard to kind of visualize in terms of the impacts on that development. But actually what we can do is using standard figures from Natural England. So they give us a wetland reduction rate. So that's the, if you were to build a wetland, how many kilograms per hectare per year that wetland might remove from wherever it's taking the water from. They give us a value of 12, an arbitrary value of 12. You've then got your serial reversion rates. That's if you were to take land out of production, specifically cereal land. That gives us a 0.96 kilograms per hectare per year. So in the case of our 2 sites, or our 2 examples, that's looking like 5 hectares of wetland for site 1 with a permit, or 63 hectares of cereal land. Or if you're going to a site without a permit, you're looking at a absolutely massive wetland of 42 hectares, or removing cereal land from production in the order of 516 hectares of cereal land. So we can see taking 516 hectares of cereal land out of production is not exactly a sustainable or feasible solution. So this is where we start to get into a little bit of trouble, where we're going to these different wastewater treatment works, and it just illustrates quite nicely how key those permit levels are and the impacts that can have. So we've talked about the problem, we've talked about the scale of the problem and looking at a worked example, but what can we actually do about it? So the good news is there is solutions. Next slide, please. So from a local authority basis, there are strategic solutions, options for strategic solutions available. So things like large scale wetlands, specific improvements to the actual designated site itself. buffer strips and bank stabilization. So I talked about the watercourses that run through these areas of agricultural land, and the soil erosion associated with that is one of the reasons why that those nutrients is actually getting into the watercourses. So if we can stabilize those banks and we can provide buffer strips and fencing to stop cattle tramping down the banks of those watercourses, it will stop that kind of point of connectivity between for the nutrients getting into the watercourses. They can obviously approve suitable developer mitigation schemes and be supportive in that sense. And as many local authorities have already done, they can create catchment specific calculators. So that is really helpful when looking at specific areas. Obviously, Natural England have issued this guidance for that entire, for all of the catchments affected across the country. And as we all know, that there are different things that there are different area of region specific parameters that we can take into account, which will change the way that actually that calculation is undertaken. So creating those catchment specific calculators is a great way of doing that. And then finally, credit schemes. So either designing your local authority led credit schemes or bringing in third-party credit schemes and getting involved with them. And there is some government support available for local authorities. So there is funding for cross-local authority work, specifically for dedicated catchment officers. And then again, as I've already mentioned, there's credit trading scheme trials happening with Entrade in Solent and in Somerset. So there is support there. There is funding, and it's just tapping into that. So I'm actually going to hand over to the audience, and I'm going to raise a poll question. So I'd really appreciate if everyone could just click on their answer. Next slide, please. So the poll is that if you work for a local authority that is affected by nutrient neutrality, has any progress been made towards a strategic mitigation scheme? So the answers are just yes, no, or do not know. But if you do have anything you'd like to elaborate on, if you any good news stories or thoughts that you'd like to share in addition to these questions, then please do add some additional commentary in the comments section. So I'll just give you all a minute or so to just answer your. So it's looking like we've got it's mostly either no or do not know, but we do have some saying yes that we do. So that's fantastic to hear. So it's about 17% at the moment saying yes, 40 to no, and 43 to do not know. Yeah. So I think that's great. I mean, what we have to remember is that obviously, a lot of the catchments have only been affected since March. The guidance only came out in March, so we're really early days. Even those that have had the guidance for longer, it's still very early days in terms of coming up with something as big as a strategic strategy. So yeah, it's good to hear that there are some that are making progress. Next slide, please. So continuing on the theme of what can we do about it, and I think I've alluded to this already, is the regulated water-led, so wastewater treatment work upgrades, both in terms of capacity, so removing that kind of overflow situation where we're getting overflows into our water systems, but also treatment levels. So that's that permit level point, improving the treatment at the treatment works, and actually having those permits secured at a low enough rate that actually makes a difference. Another thing that regulated water companies can actually do is look at catchment balancing. So that is a way that they're looking at now to actually, rather than having necessarily the permit, is actually just reducing what is actually getting there. So it's an offsetting sort of situation as well. And again, so government government support, the Secretary of State for DEFRA has issued a call for evidence for suitable projects to share knowledge and share experience, and actually hopefully be able to kind of share that knowledge across the whole country of good examples of things that are happening already, because there are lots of things that are happening already across the country which are having a really good impact. So next slide, please. And so finally, we've got developer-led. So obviously, in terms of the planning applications, the developers are all, or mostly are stuck in the planning system, not being able to get their approvals through because of this whole nutrient neutrality issue. So the things that they can do about it is to actually develop good and well thought out mitigation schemes that actually, rather than maybe kicking the can down the road, actually look to start to solve the problem. And they can do this by, specifically looking at nature-based solutions like constructed wetlands. They can look at things like arable reversion and altering their SUD schemes on site to make sure that they're having suitable levels of treatment for the surface water runoff. Short-term fallowing, so just as a way to kind of get through planning. Credit schemes, so looking at buying into those credit schemes where other developers have come forward with larger mitigation than is needed for their site, and they have that additional capacity there to provide the credits. So and then finally, undertaking obviously the habitats regulations assessment, which is where all of this will get kind of tied together at the end of that process. So next slide, please. So over to you guys again, and it's a little bit of a vague question for you, but I just want to know: do you think that developers are doing enough? Of the things I just talked about in terms of potential mitigation. Is that enough? Is that no detriment approach enough? And is the can being kicked down the road, or are we looking at meaningful schemes that are providing additional benefits? Thinking about nature-based solutions that provide additional kind of multi-benefits, and rather than just answering this nutrient neutrality question. So again, we've just got yes, no, or don't know, but any thoughts or ideas or anything that you'd like to put into the chat, then please do so. So we're looking at a mix between no and don't know at the moment. There is a few that have said, so 14% of saying yes, 46% is no, and 39% is do not know. I think as a sort of an additional question to this, and maybe just pop a comment in the chat. Do you think that developers have enough information? Is there enough information out there and support for them to be able to do enough? Just an extra thought there. So thanks everyone for answering that. Can I have the next slide, please? So I've talked a little bit about nature-based solutions, and I'm going to now run through some examples of nature-based solutions and what we really mean what I really mean when I say nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So nature-based solutions, specifically in the form of something like constructed wetlands or on-site SUDs to reduce the nutrient loading in the surface water runoff. They can be very effective if well designed at removing both nitrogen and phosphorus. They should be suitably located, so they have to be, although they can be anywhere in the catchment, they don't have to be directly associated with a particular development that they're looking to offset, but they do have to be within the same catchment. So they have to be removing and treating water that is going to end up in the same place as the water that comes from the residential development. So they don't have to be necessarily next door to each other, but within that same hydrological catchment. Next slide, please. So I'm going to touch a little bit more on constructed wetlands, simply because we have a case study to run through of a integrated constructed wetland that has been designed specifically to mitigate the phosphate budget for a residential development. So an integrated constructed wetland is a large, shallow marsh type area. So the clue's in the name, it's wetland. It's generally fed from a watercourse. So either a portion of that flow in the watercourse is diverted into an area of flat-ish land, or the whole watercourse, depending on the scale of the watercourse, or the whole watercourse can be diverted and sent through the whole wetland. The key thing in terms of treating nutrients is to make sure that there's a broad diversity of plant species. So we're not looking at reed beds here. Constructed wetlands are not necessarily reed beds. Reed beds are a monoculture, so they have just one type of plant in it generally, or one or two types of plant in it. We're looking at something that has marginal planting, and it does have reeds in it, but it has lots of other types of planting in it that improves the biodiversity of the wetland itself, and actually helps in the mechanism of removing the nutrients from the water. And obviously there are multiple benefits of constructed wetlands and nature-based solutions. Biodiversity is one of them. Flood storage, so increasing by digging out an area of alongside a watercourse, you're increasing the capacity of that area of land for storing flood water, which is in turn going to have a positive impact downstream. And also amenity. So I don't know whether anybody has been to for a walk around a wetland, but there are plenty of nature reserves and things with wetlands on them, and the amount of wildlife and plants and insects and things like that you can see just by walking around them is incredible, and they're a really lovely place to visit. So actually they bring kind of public open space and amenity benefits, as well as the ecological and hydrological benefits, and obviously nutrient treatment. Next slide, please. So we're just going to run through now a case study. So the case study is called Staple Grove ICW, or Integrated Constructed Wetland. Next slide, please. And the challenge here was a new community. So it was 750 new homes on a 40-hectare site. The nutrient budget was around 75 kilograms per year that was generated by this development. I will say that this development is being discharged to a treatment works which has got a permit, which is why we're looking at a lower budget. Next slide, please. So the answer that we came up with was a constructed wetland. This is on the screen now. You can see one of two sites. So the mitigation was approximately 4.5 hectares of wetland, and that was calculated using the concentration of the phosphorus that was present in the watercourse that was going to be feeding these wetlands. So there was water quality monitoring data available to us, thankfully, and quite a broad amount of data was available. And that was we were able to use that and put it into a model which allowed us to calculate the specific removal rate of that these wetlands could achieve. And so that is what determined the area that was required. So I talked previously about the standard number that Natural England gives us of 12 kilograms per hectare per year. So our calculations using the specific concentration in the watercourse gave us a removal rate of 19 kilograms per hectare. So it did have it has a good impact, actually being able to look at the data that's available to you. The other thing we had to take into account was obviously the flow rate of the watercourse. So being able to get those nutrients into the wetlands across the whole year. So not just in the months where we have a lot more rain, but across the drier months as well, because what you don't want is for these wetlands to go into drought. Another consideration was the topography of the site. So you're looking for something that is generally flat. You want to have a slight fall on it because these wetlands work in a kind of a multi-cell way. So you can sort of see on the screen, you've got sort of 5 cells on the one side of the watercourse and then 4 on the other. And there's a sort of a cascade system. So you get that hydraulic retention time within the wetlands, which is what helps the nutrients to actually be removed. So the nutrients are removed predominantly by sedimentation and burial rather than actually kind of biological processes within the plants themselves. The plants do take up a proportion of the nutrients, but majority of it is sedimentation. So what you want is to have that water slow enough so that sedimentation can happen. And then, so the other couple of things to note on this is the ground conditions. So looking at whether or not the site can infiltrate and will infiltrate, because what you don't want to do is create a pathway between the surface water and the groundwater, which is going to then introduce those pollutants into the groundwater where it's not necessary. So that's something to bear in mind. And if it is an area that is got high infiltration rates, then you're going to be looking at lining those, which is going to come at a cost implication. And then finally, utilities search. So you can see on the site we've got some low voltage power cables running across the site. So we obviously had to liaise with the utilities company to make sure that they were happy that we could actually undertake excavations underneath those lines. So next slide, please. So I've covered some of this already, but in terms of the specific phosphate removal rate, we use what's called the PKC model. And in terms of the understanding the actual amount of flows that are going to come to the wetland, we use a low flows assessment. So using the FEH catchment, you can calculate how much water is actually going to get there in the different seasons. So for this planning application, so it was a full application, and we obviously had to undertake flood risk assessments specifically to the wetlands. So aside from separated from the residential development itself, but specifically for the wetlands, to demonstrate that, of course, we're not increasing flood risk up or downstream. Ecology surveys had to be undertaken to determine the baseline, so to understand the ecological condition on the site pre-wetland. That was then to enable us to see whether or not what the biodiversity net gain looked like, but also then obviously to make sure that there are no species on site that actually are going to be adversely impacted by the construction of a wetland. Visual impact assessment was important. So working with the landscape officer at the local authority to make sure that actually, these are not going to be an eyesore, that the small amount of infrastructure that is needed for them. So that's in the form of sort of wooden weir boards. We've got a leaky dam in the watercourse. Things like that aren't going to form an eyesore on what is otherwise fairly open, green, arable land. A soil management plan, so looking at because we're excavating material, where that material is going to go, and obviously with it being within the flood zone. So this site in particular, so the site on the west, so the kind of long thin site, is entirely within flood zone 2. So obviously raising the land is not an option in that case. You don't want to be removing flood storage. We're only kind of gaining flood storage here. That's the aim. So we had to make sure that we weren't kind of raising up the land significantly. And then finally, just to talk about monitoring and maintenance. So the maintenance schedule that we produced was something that was requested by the LPA, and you can draw parallels from the maintenance schedule for this as you would do for something like a SUDS scheme maintenance schedule. So taken from the SUDS manual, there are kind of annual and biannual and monthly in the first kind of year maintenance activities. Constructed wetlands are designed, and nature-based solutions in general are designed to be low maintenance. They're not going to be no maintenance, because they are still going to need someone to go out and cut the grass and make sure that there aren't kind of invasive plant species that are taking over the whole wetland and things like that. So they're never going to be no maintenance, but they are certainly low maintenance. And in terms of the monitoring, so obviously we were very lucky on this site where we had that monitoring data available to us in terms of the water quality. But what we need to do now, and once this is constructed, is to go out and actually gather data on how it's actually working. So what is actually happening. So we'll be taking water quality samples from the top end and then from the bottom end to make sure that actually it's doing what we think it will, and to what extent, how efficient is it. And that will then form the basis of kind of a compliance statement, which will then form part of the appropriate assessment and the habitats regulations assessment. So that will kind of then tie the residential development and the required mitigation from that to this mitigation strategy. So up until now, they're completely separate applications, they're separate sites. But that process then, once we've got that data and we've got that certainty, which is something that obviously, Natural England are very keen on having that certainty. So that will then allow us to have that certainty and actually tie them together. So just on that, one of the things that we did during this project as well was to make sure that we were liaising with with Natural England, with the LPA, with the EA, and making sure that that conversation and that communication was open. So as soon as we had an outline strategy, what we thought we were gonna do, we did a feasibility study across a number of different areas, different sites that we had available, chose this one or these two. And we then took that to Natural England and said, this is what we're planning. We showed them our calculations for the specific phosphate removal rates and, basically agreed in principle. And that meant that, there was no objections as yet. So next slide, please. So that draws my presentation to an end. I just have some kind of concluding points, really. So firstly, that there are feasible mitigation solutions available. They do exist. Obviously, there are constraints associated with them, as there are with anything, but there are solutions. It is a case-by-case basis, and it isn't, as you've seen with the differences with the wastewater treatment works, there isn't a one-size-fits-all, and actually, going from one treatment works to another can have significant impacts. Similarly, ground conditions, rainfall, all of that, there are so many different parameters within these calculations that there isn't really a generic answer. It is very much case by case, one site at a time approach. Developer-led mitigation strategies will form a no detriment approach. So by mitigating only what they are, the net change in what they're producing, that forms a no detriment approach. Now, what I think will happen is that the more of these kind of in catchments and mitigation solutions we see coming forward, so the more sort of, maybe wetlands you see dotted around, the kind of cumulative effect of those is probably going to be a positive. But individually, the developer-led is taking that kind of no detriment approach. And strategic solutions are key for the future betterment, so actually improving these designated sites rather than just not making them worse. Something strategic has to happen to do that, whether that is in the form of wastewater treatment works upgrades and actually bringing forward that, or whether that is actually improvements to designated sites or larger scale wetland systems, which will help to remove the nutrients within the catchment. So thank you. I'm going to hand you back over to Victoria now for the Q&A.
Thank you, Gemma. That was great. So much information. Really,
thanks everyone.
Great to follow. And yeah, lots of applause there for you. Thank you. So there's been an awful lot in the chat. There have been questions that I know the team have tried to answer as we go along, which is fantastic. We've got a number of questions that perhaps we could explore in more detail throughout this Q&A. So could I please ask Alan and Lisa to come along and put your cameras on? Great, fantastic. And what we'll do is we'll start off with one of the early questions, which asked or stated, development planning is only a small part of nutrient pollution. So why is planning being singled out for the solution? Sewage is a bigger problem, as is agriculture. And yet it seems planners are being beaten up over this by developers and the public. So would Alan, would you like to start, and Gemma, and let's get your thoughts on this? Thank you.
I'll start with that one, Victoria, if I can try and answer. I think actually it's the easy target, actually, being brutally honest. I think it's an easy target as something that can be controlled by Natural England, and they can have a go at it. It's an easy one that can be done. It can be stopped. It can be controlled. There is, of course, the water companies need to look at investment in their water treatment works to actually make improvements, but that's part of an investment program which they would last for several years. So ultimately, that will be part of the package. But the kind of soft underbelly of the impact is the development industry. So that cynics would say that's the one that's being targeted first, but that's the reality of it, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, Lisa.
That's okay. Go on, Gemma.
No, I was just going to say, I think that although this is hitting the planning system and planners, I think that, I don't want to sound cheesy, but we can all work together. And actually, certainly we as consultants are trying to work with local authorities and kind of try and form those links between local authorities and developers, and then developers and other developers. We're increasingly seeing developers working together, which I think is fantastic, where you've got areas of significant growth and you've got multiple different developers who are trying to bring forward sites in one area, actually work together, and they're starting to do that. And actually I think that that's going to be a positive that will come out of this, or I hope it's a positive that comes out of this.
I was just going to add to that as well. So it is about decision points, because the habitats regulations apply at the point of having a planning decision, and there are the equivalents, I suppose, in the water company sector, but it's not. It doesn't catch ongoing activities, and that's perhaps the issue. But the government has made it clear that there are going to be actions taken in those other sectors as well. So, for example, the strategic policy statement for Ofwat now specifically refers to nutrient obligations and nutrient pollution, and there's also farming investment fund activity as well. So DEFRA on the 16th of March published a policy paper around the other actions that are taken in those sectors, in addition to the development sector.
Great, thank you. So that does link to another question that came in, and maybe Lisa, you could stay with us. And the question really is around capacity and resources, and it says most planning teams and local government don't have the resources to provide current services effectively. So where are the resources to come from for these additional assessments? Do you have any thoughts on that, Lisa?
Yeah, so to start with, I suppose there is an obligation on the developer as applicant to put together a lot of the evidence base in order to inform the assessment that ultimately the planning authority needs to make. Also, DLUC did announce £100,000 in funding for each affected catchment when the announcement was made in March about additional areas affected. So looking to local authorities within each affected catchment to appoint a lead local authority, and then that funding can be used to start looking at nutrient mitigation options as well. And further to that, Natural England has expanded its casework capacity. So Natural England, acting as the nature conservation advisor to local authorities, should have a greater ability to provide support to local authorities that are affected by this.
Thank you. So there's another question regarding the casework and the workload for planning teams. And it asks, is this being applied to schemes retrospectively on schemes of planning, but with outstanding planning conditions? Is that something that, Gemma, you'd like to come in on, and perhaps Lisa, we can get your thoughts as well?
Yeah, of course. Can you just repeat the question? Sorry, Victoria.
Of course, yeah. Is this being applied to schemes retrospectively on schemes of planning, but with outstanding planning conditions?
So it has been. I think predominantly it's affecting planning applications that haven't got consent yet. But that is right up until, it could be reserve matters. You could be about to press the button on a reserve matters application and get hit. Or, it would have been in March, obviously. But but we have seen certainly one that has had a planning condition which has then been hit. But actually it's about working with their LPA to overcome that, because actually that's not what the Natural England guidance says. It is about that. Does it have consent or not?
I think just to sort of follow up on that, Natural England's advice back in March was that the requirement to consider nutrients applies to planning applications at the reserve matters, a stage, and to grants of prior approval and to certificates of lawfulness for a proposed use or operation. But then other local authorities have gone out and got their own legal advice, and then I think there's a divergence of opinion from different barristers about exactly how this applies. And so it's really down to the councils of the competent authorities for the habitats regulations. It's ultimately their decision to take about what can be approved, and so some are taking sort of a risk-based approach and are discharging conditions, but not those that relate to drainage or something like that. So it's really down to the council planning officers in conjunction with their own legal teams to decide what's an appropriate approach.
Thank you. We're still with you, Lisa. Actually, this is a question that would be good to get you to think of first. Is there any mapping of areas that could potentially be at risk in the future? So is there any way of local authorities identifying what could be coming down the line for them?
So I suppose mapping information is available. So Natural England has information available online about site condition. And I suppose that's really the starting point, particularly in terms of an evidence base for a local plan. If there are catchments, habitat sites that are functionally linked to a local authority area or linked to development proposals in that plan, then it would be for the local authority to look and see how proposals in the plan or indeed development proposals are likely to affect that site. And if there's likely to be a significant effect, that's when the habitats regulations would be looking for evidence to ensure that an adverse effect on that site can be ruled out. So again, I think Natural England can be helpful here, can provide help for local authorities in that situation, and they can look to see what monitoring data is available about the condition of that site. Because that information again is publicly available and can be used as an evidence base to inform plans. And so local authorities might want to talk to Natural England area teams about the sites within their area at those particular points, whether it's plan making or considering development proposals. It's their role as sort of nature conservation advisor to support that process.
So it sounds like you've answered another question that's come in, which says, could large strategic sites in principle proposed in areas which have not currently been designated tip those areas into being areas of nutrient neutrality concern? So it sounds like that could potentially happen from what you're saying, Lisa, and that's something to watch out for.
I don't think a large sites proposal would tip it into because the point with the habitats regulations is you're looking at an early stage before the proposal's gone ahead about what the potential impact of that proposal would be on the designated site. So it's all part of the evidence base for making a planning decision about whether that proposal can proceed without having an adverse effect on a designated site. And so the impact wouldn't be seen until further into the future through monitoring data, and that's why we considered the proposals at an early stage to decide whether that's acceptable given the likely impact of that proposal on the site. I don't know, Alan or Gemma, if you wanted to come in a bit on that.
No, I think you've covered it brilliantly.
It's a proactive approach, and I suppose that's the idea being ultimately that any decisions taken should be protecting those designated sites, recognising that they are protected from adverse effects, and that would include nutrient pollution.
Yeah,
that's really clear. Wonderful. So next question, this is for all of you, so perhaps shout if you want to go first. Can you use credit schemes if the designated site is in an unfavourable condition?
As in for your mitigation, can you use credit schemes? So yeah, if there is credit schemes available in your area, you can. What we are seeing, I don't know, Lisa, from your perspective, but what we're seeing is, like I said before, where we've got people working together. So rather than it necessarily going through that credit scheme, it's actually, someone is developing this mitigation strategy and they can facilitate the mitigation of their development plus a additional amount. Obviously, the issue with this at the moment is that we are very early days and we haven't yet reached a point where we're far enough down the line that something has been constructed, something has got consent based on the fact that, based on it being neutral and has a constructed mitigation strategy and has proven that it has those additional credits. Because when we're looking at mitigation schemes and having additional credits or having credits to sell, this whole kind of prospect of credits, you have to be able to prove it with certainty that you have those credits available. And I haven't seen personally any schemes where it's far enough down the line. The only thing that I'm aware of is obviously we've got N-Trade, and then obviously in Herefordshire, you've got the credit scheme there, which is only based on the clearing the backlog and removing the backlog. So I think its applications validated before 31st of October last year. So
I think we're there. There's huge opportunity for developers to work together with local authorities and actually to come together and find strategic solutions. I think there's the kind of strategy and solution that Gemma's spoken through, as we mentioned earlier on, has got a huge amount of resilience within it that could be sold back into the industry. And actually some of those, if that's the solution that's coming forward in a particular area, some of those greenfield solutions can then effectively sell credits back into the town centre and smaller sites as well. I mean, there's a comment in the questions earlier on about, does this bring the end to small developments, up to about below 50 dwellings? Well, the solution we talked through today is actually only really works above a certain level, so it's that's part of the story. And I think, I'm based in the southwest, but actually we've seen schemes of one or two dwellings refused for this region as well. So it's part of the story, but actually it's working together with the local authority and developers, finding small schemes, big schemes, off-site, on-site, all coming together as part of the wider package.
Great, it's good that you've tackled that, because that did come up a lot in the chat regarding smaller schemes, small rural schemes in particular. Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to go on to thinking about some of the practicalities and potentially more technical questions. There's a question here. In fact, there's probably 2 or 3 questions that are related to maintenance and dredging. So I'll start off with this one. It says, I'm assuming that mitigation measures such as wetlands will eventually need maintenance or dredging to remove contaminants from the land. How would this be managed, and where would the contaminants go? Gemma, do you want to start us off with that one?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So at the moment, the guidance is that it would be removed and then likely spread in a catchment that isn't affected by nutrient neutrality. Obviously, that's bringing about issues in itself, because, is that then going to cause issues? Is that actually then going to just kind of tip the issue into the next catchment over? And I think that's where, changing agricultural practices comes in, and actually removing fertilizer altogether isn't necessarily going to happen, but reducing it, and so spreading it in a reduced amount is likely to be a lot better than the amounts that it is being spread at the moment. So that's how it is at the moment. The aim is that it shouldn't be, you shouldn't have, it shouldn't be a regular thing that happens. It's every sort of few years. So we're talking about something that's going to happen every maybe 2 or 3 years, rather than something that's happening every other month, and you've got bucket loads of of sediment to go and spread somewhere. So I think that they're the kind of 2 key points with that.
Thank you. Now, one of the questions did refer to how the silt from dredging should be classified. Is it always treated as a contaminated material?
That's a good question. To be honest, I would not know that answer. I would say that from my experience, it's not, because even though it does have the nutrients aren't necessarily a contaminant. But I'm not a waste engineer, so I'd have to revert back to someone who knows a bit more about the Clare eggs.
But do you know what? There's a brilliant thing about the sessions this week, because occasionally things do come up, and sometimes we have people in the chat who know the answer. But it's actually really good to help us think about the next time that we respond to these kind of topics. What are those things that still within the sector we don't know? So that's great, and it's good to know. Even just a signpost. Where would people start to go to get some of these further answers? Okay, wonderful. Right. So we've got time for a few more questions, and we've got some more coming through the chat. There's a question here about how we identify catchment areas. Is this something, Gemma, you'd be able to help us with?
Yeah, so the plan that I showed in my presentation has got the catchment areas that are associated with those designated sites, which are shown to have habitats of unfavourable conditions. So they're defined by Natural England. Unfortunately, there isn't necessarily a kind of movable map that you can kind of interrogate in real detail, but if you look at the Water Framework Directive catchments, they're generally right. If you're right on the cusp of a catchment, then it becomes a little bit more difficult, but
I was just going to add to that as well, the boundaries of the sites themselves, so the special protection areas and special areas of conservation under the habitats regulations are mapped on the MAGIC website. It's a DEFRA run website, so people can just go into there, and it's quite intuitive to use. You can look up all sorts of things, environmental data on there, and find your location and put on lots of different layers, but that includes designated sites, SSSIs and others as well.
Really clear. Lisa, since you're with me, you're on my screen now, I can see you. Would you have a go at answering the next question? It's about the role of Natural England. And this question asks, does Natural England provide support to the developers to help them come up with options and mitigation measures? It'd be good to understand the other side. Most people here are from local government. What kind of support is there for developers as well as for local government?
Okay, so one source of support for developers or indeed local government could be the Homes England technical panels, because we have panels, framework agreements with technical experts who are able to provide advice on this kind of matter, so water quality and pollution. So any public authority can get sign an access agreement and appoint consultants if they need to from that panel. The other source of information, so from Natural England, they have a discretionary advice service, the DAS service, and that means that you can consult Natural England and get their advice and views, I suppose, on proposed mitigation measures. And it's a paid for service, but it means that before you put your planning application in, you've had a response from Natural England who's considered the options that you're proposing for mitigation, and they can review sort of calculations and that kind of thing. So that can be a useful service for developers as well, and gives them a bit more certainty. And I'm aware that Natural England as well are putting out guidance this summer on various matters to support developers and local authorities. So with Ricardo, they're producing some guidance on the effectiveness of a range of nature-based solutions, and also a tool to help assess nutrient reduction and the recommended solutions that could be appropriate, taking account of different contexts. And there's also some guidance coming out, I think, on wetlands as well. I'm just going to have a quick check of the details on that, but basically, yeah, we are expecting to see some a bit more guidance coming this summer. I think it's guidance on SUDS that's being produced with Wiltshire Council. Again, which will be available for other councils to use as well. So just to give a bit more information and evidence base, I think that's the challenge with the habitats regulations. It's quite a high bar for the evidence that's needed by the local authority in order to be satisfied that the mitigation will be effective and therefore enable them to grant planning permission.
I think just in addition to that, just what I would say in terms of the DAS service is just from experience is that because Natural England are under immense amounts of pressure at the moment, they generally will only accept it if you have at least an outline mitigation strategy to come forwards with. My experience has been that if you've got kind of 5 options, they want you to wait until you're actually at the point where you have an option that is your preferred option, you have evidence to back up that option, and that's what you're going to go with, and then that's when they'll look to consult, certainly from the developer perspective anyway. And understandably so.
Fantastic. Right, so we've covered an awful lot there, and I think also collectively you've manned the chat and answered lots of questions. So I'll draw the Q&A to a close there, and thank you so much. If we could get the slides back up. So if you've posed a question today and you don't feel it's been answered, email us. This is the Local Government Capacity Centre email address, and we'll try and get an answer for you. Let me say thank you to our amazing speakers, and the local government capacity team, and for all of you for attending. Thank you so much. Goodbye.